Okay, so while we're setting up, I first of all wanted to thank the Chancellor, he's not here, and Professor Archer for inviting me to this important conference, and to the Academy for hosting me. Now, I want to say also that in the written paper that accompanies the talk, I discuss two things, settlement and integration. And I broadened the focus of my original mandate, which was to talk only about Australasia, so Australia and New Zealand. So I broadened that, and I also have included some Southeast Asian countries because I wanted to allow some comparative reflections and to engage a little bit with some of my more recent research, which is in Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So first of all, what I want to do is give some background, and then for the first half of the presentation, I want to talk to the themes in my paper. And for the second half of the presentation, I want to relate some things from some of my current projects. And I want to do that not just because I enjoy talking about them, but because I think that they may present some novel insights, well, hopefully they will, in relation to the themes that we're discussing today, particularly concerning integration. And I also want to add some of my recent projects to the presentation because I'm dealing more explicitly with trafficking of men. And I think that it's something we often touch on, and so we need to know more about it, but not many people do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. So first of all, the background. This paper, instead of being deep research on one particular context, is sort of a compendium of a number of different research projects that I've worked on, I guess, over the last decade. And so my presentation and the paper draws selectively on all of those projects rather than it being just about one. So the projects that I'll be introducing and touching on in the presentation and the paper are one that I did quite a few years ago now on Thai women in Australia's sex industry. Can you hear me? Is that working? Filipino women in South Korea in the sex and nightlife entertainment sector that's operating around US military bases. A study I did just a few years ago on Indonesian and Filipino women in Singapore's nightlife entertainment sector. And a study on domestic trafficking. I think, again, we haven't really talked so much about domestic trafficking in the conference. Domestic trafficking of women and girls into Cebu's sex industry, Cebu in the Philippines. And more recently, two studies that I've been working on in Singapore. The first one with South Asian men working in Singapore's construction, landscaping and marine sectors. And the second one of Indonesian, Cambodian and Filipino men who have been trafficked onto Taiwanese long-haul fishing vessels, often transiting through Singapore. So as I said, my study sort of draws differently and hopefully to illustrate some novel points on all of those studies, but not in detail on any one of them. So first of all, I want to just go through the two main themes in the paper. The first one that the paper touches on are things that we've already been hearing about in other presentations this morning concerning issues of settlement And I have to say that when Margaret asked me to talk about settlement in Australasia, I was at a little bit of a loss because of the 6 countries that I'm discussing in this talk, only one of those countries has any kind of permanent settlement program. So, it's okay. So the only country is Australia, thankfully. And so I'll draw on the Australian experience just briefly to touch on problems relating to settlement, victim settlement. So as I said, Australia is the only country of the ones I'm considering here that has an option for permanent stay. And, you know, this is quite surprising, I think, because Singapore and New Zealand are both developed destination countries for trafficking, but neither of those countries has a permanent settlement program. And of course, the other 3 I'm discussing, Cambodia, Vietnam and the Philippines, of course, they do not either. So let me just talk briefly about the Australia's program for settlement and what I see as 2 of the main problems accompanying that. Australia has an option for what is called a permanent witness protection visa, or a T visa. And in reviewing the number of successful applicants for that visa over the past few years, one of the notable things is how extraordinarily low the numbers of recipients of those visas has been. So the latest statistic that I could find was for 2012, where there were only 12 of those visas issued. And part of the problem with the permanent settlement process in Australia and actually gaining access to this T visa is the number of what I call approval hurdles that a trafficked person has to jump through in order to receive this visa. So the 2 main hurdles are, first of all, it's only granted if the Attorney General directly certifies that the person has made a contribution to and closely cooperated with police. So again, we have another context in which a visa for settlement is very much tied to cooperation with the authorities and cooperation in investigations. So that's the first hurdle. It's up to the Attorney General to make a discretionary decision as to the level of contribution that a trafficked person has made to an investigation and prosecution process. The second hurdle is that the Minister for Immigration must consider that the trafficked person is in danger if they return to their home country. So to get one of the T visas, a person must have or go through both of those approval hurdles. And that to me explains largely why the numbers are so low. So that's a problem, is this not only proving victimhood, but problems associated with qualifying for permanent stay in the destination country, in this case in Australia. The second issue that I want to look at in relation to settlement, and again, you know, we're talking only about Australia because it is the only context that has a settlement program of the countries I'm talking about, is issues of starting a new life. And again, it's been mentioned by many of the other speakers today and last week. The need for jobs is paramount because many trafficked people, or most trafficked people to Australia, need to realise unfulfilled economic goals. But what I want to emphasise is Australia does have a program that that enables trafficked persons under their support program to avail jobs. They're allowed to work. But what I want to emphasise is that eligibility to work is not the same thing as being able to work. And I think in Australia, amongst the many Thai women that I knew who were eligible for this program, less than 10% of them actually found work. So I think that's an important point to emphasise, that eligibility and actually working are not necessarily the same thing. And some trafficking victims can look for weeks or months for decent jobs and be unable to find them, including in Australia. In Australia, under the Trafficking Victims Support Program, as well as the legal ability to work, victims are also able to avail social welfare supports. But the level of social welfare, the actual amount of money that a trafficked person is able to receive on this program is extremely low. So again, amongst the Thai women that were in my study in Australia, none of them could actually survive on the amount of money that they were given each fortnight. And so this is problematic in two senses. Firstly, it's problematic if women cannot also find a job, even when they're eligible. And it's also problematic because many of the women I knew ended up going back to ex-customers or other people associated with the industry that they just escaped from in order to have some kind of additional support, whether it was accommodation, whether it was food or clothes or whatever it might have been. So, relying on the support of ex-customers, it's a debatable issue about whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly if one is traumatised by the experience of being sex trafficked, going back and being in the company of ex-customers is really not an ideal situation. And again, that stems from the inadequacy of the levels of social support that the women were receiving and their inability to make ends meet with the money that they were allocated through social welfare. So this is some of the longer term problems that I see that relate to settlement in terms of starting a new life, at least in Australia. And many women end up relying on social networks and co-ethnic networks to help support them. I want to also touch on issues of integration as related to my discussion in the paper. And I think we've already talked about the need for long-term rather than short-term supports in a variety of contexts, including Australia, and the range of supports. And so, of course, they fall primarily into three areas: health and economic and social supports. But I think the lesson that I have learned from most of my research projects looking at integration is that, of course, a range of supports are needed, but it's often difficult to generalise supports. I really liked Mr. Hagen's presentation this morning, where he said you have individual case assessment, and I think that is really important because standard measures often don't work, and each person has very specific experiences, history and needs, and I think taking that into account in designing longer term integration supports is very important. So a careful assessment of needs, including health needs, I think is paramount. Economic support, I think, also needs to be discussed much more critically. And of course, we know that trafficked persons want to get a new job, or they want some livelihood option. They want some training or some skill or some money to start a business. But I think particularly what I've found in Southeast Asia is that many of these livelihood options that are given to trafficked persons in the context of reintegration are actually not that appropriate. And what I mean by that is that they're not necessarily giving people skills or jobs that are that useful or in demand in the communities where they're living. So I know many young women in Cambodia are trained as hairdressers when they're reintegrated, but actually poor Cambodian rural communities can't really afford to have regular haircuts. So, you know, it's not really a practicable option. And if the options are not very practical, then people are more likely to re-migrate, including taking options for risky migration. So there's problems about what skills, what livelihoods are needed, what training is actually needed, and whether it actually has a decent income generating capacity or not. And another problem that I've actually found with livelihoods, and again, this is very specific, I think, to the GMS, the Greater Mekong Sub-region countries, is that survivors of trafficking are often put together in a place of employment, and the shop or whatever it is, one of the ways in which this business is promoted is that it's a business for survivors of trafficking. So I actually find that really problematic because it's just like a broad sign that says to the general public, here are 10 trafficked women, formerly trafficked women in this business. And so I think that kind of very explicit identification of survivors in the context of trying to move on from the trafficking experience is also very difficult. And I've seen many NGOs do this in both Vietnam and Cambodia. Here is a business run by trafficking survivors, so let's support them. And I don't think that that's particularly helpful to move on. The other thing I wanted to say from my paper about integration is that many victims of trafficking deliberately avoid reintegration supports. So the Filipino entertainers that I studied in South Korea, fishermen from the Philippines who returned, they all avoided support. They didn't want to be rescued because rescue entailed being put in a shelter and being rehabilitated in ways that didn't allow them to realise the lost economic opportunities that they had migrated for in the first place. So the question is, and I think this also needs more research, is why do people deliberately avoid integration? And why do they avoid scenarios where they're going to be placed in care? And some of the reasons that I've come up with from my various projects are that supports are often inappropriately given from a standard raft or package of measures. This fear or this desire not to be institutionalised. And also that many trafficking victims are removed from their social networks and their social supports. And I think Kate mentioned this morning in relation to having people around you who speak the same language. And when you're in the shelter, you may only have one or no people who speak the same language as you. So those social support networks are effectively removed when a person is identified and put in some kind of formal care program. Another thing, particularly in relation to men in the fishing industry in the Philippines, when I traced them back into their communities and asked them why they didn't seek support and why they didn't want to lay charges against their traffickers, one of the interesting things was that the traffickers lived in the same communities as them. So they didn't want to make any trouble in the community. And so that's also an important reason why victims of trafficking can reject reintegration supports. They don't want to make any more trouble within the communities, and maybe they're intimidated by the trafficker who lives nearby. And lastly, in the Philippines, when I looked at domestic trafficking of women in Cebu's sex industry, I actually lived in one of the shelters with the women for several weeks, and that really gave me some interesting insights into the way shelters and rehabilitation programs worked. But one of the concerns that many of the women and girls in that shelter had was where they would actually go when they were released from the rehabilitation program. Because many of them had come from broken homes. And again, this is a theme that we heard this morning. So they couldn't return home. So after being institutionalised for 2 years and being ready to return to society, actually the shelter didn't know where to integrate these women. So that's also another problem, is where they go. And particularly, I think, for women and girls who come from broken homes, including in the case of this shelter where women had been raped, where there'd been incest, or where they'd experienced violence and even the death of the violent death of a family member. So these women and girls could not return to those kinds of situations. So that was quite a big problem. Now, perhaps what I'd like to do in the last 9 minutes is to move on from the issues that I discuss in the formal paper, and you can read in more detail into all of the points that I've just touched on. And what I want to do is to look at some of the current projects that I'm trying to conduct, more so in Southeast Asia and then Australasia, and look at perhaps some of the other insights that these might give us about issues of integration and reintegration. So let me just introduce you to a few of these projects, and perhaps we can have some reflections on them at the end. The first one is what I call the Diaries Project, and this is in the context of my work with South Asian men in the construction, primarily in the construction sector in Singapore. And this idea came out of my research with these men because I found it very difficult to have frank and open discussions about feelings with some of my participants. So I asked them if they would like to write diaries about their experiences and about their daily life. And these men were incredibly prolific, and some of them filled, whatever it is, 80-page notebooks about their experiences. So I've got some extraordinary data and information. And some of the stories were so compelling that I decided that with the permission of the participants, I wanted to publish them as a book. And so last year, in conjunction with 2 NGO people in Singapore, we got together and we translated and edited these stories, and we published them as a book. And what we have done is we have used that book to raise awareness about situations of labour trafficking and labour exploitation in Singapore, both to the general public and to other migrant workers. And in the book, we've put 12 points of advice for migrant workers, so they can read these stories and think, gee, I don't know if I really want to go to Singapore. And if they still want to go, they can read some of the things that they might do to make their migration safer. So it's an awareness-raising project in part, and it's also, I think, a little bit about reintegration, because we try to distribute these books to communities in the home countries, which is primarily Bangladesh and the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, because we want families to know what these people have gone through in Singapore, and when they come home broken and broke, to accept them and not judge them and not stigmatise them. And so we hope that the awareness raising is not just limited to Singapore, but also helps in the context of men who are reintegrating into these communities, having been trafficked and failed in their migration experiences. So that's the first project, and I received a small grant from that from a UK foundation, so we're in the process of producing a second volume of that book now. And the other thing about that project is that we actually sell the book. We don't give it away. We give it away to the workers, but we sell it to everyone else. And we use all the money to support the return process for men who are trafficked to Singapore. So there's a couple of our beneficiaries for the project. And the first one is this guy, Raja. He wasn't actually a trafficking victim, but he had a workplace injury in Singapore. And he couldn't work anymore. He was the father of 3 young children, and the sole breadwinner for his family. So after the compensation process was finished, and after he paid his legal fees in Singapore and repaid the $2,500 he spent on accommodation while he was awaiting compensation, which shouldn't happen in the first place, he had nothing left. So his compensation ended up being nothing. So we gave him $300 out of the sale of the books to buy gifts for his children and his family. And I can't emphasise how important that is for return trafficked victims, particularly, I think, men. To return home with nothing is not just a financial issue, it's an issue of stigma, and it's an issue of shame. So part of the idea of this process, or this project, is to give men the opportunity to go home with something, and at least to ameliorate that sense of failure. And the second man there, Rahman, he was a victim of trafficking from Bangladesh, and he ended up sleeping in a bin centre in Singapore and was put to work for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and eventually he escaped. And so we gave him $800 to send home because his case is still going on and he has nowhere to live in Singapore. So we gave him $800 to pay to put his daughter back in school for the rest of the year, because when he was trafficked and fell out of work, no social support in Singapore, his daughter, they couldn't pay the education fees. So we like to think that, you know, it's making some small difference in the lives of these men. The other thing, or the second thing I want to talk about quickly is this, I want to think a little bit more laterally about research on reintegration or integration. And this is a picture of, well, you can't see it that clearly, but there's 4 men there who were trafficked into Taiwan's long-haul fishing industry. And they returned home as undetected and unsupported victims of trafficking. So we looked at their experiences of return without being supported and why they chose not to be supported, and I've already mentioned that. But the other interesting thing was that we did interviews with family members, and I think that is really important in looking at reintegration, because what we wanted to know was, how did the family survive when the male breadwinner was not sending back the promised remittances because he was trafficked? And how did that maybe increase the vulnerability of other family members? For example, being taken out of school, sending younger brothers off to do other forms of precarious work. What impact does trafficking have on the family of the trafficked person? So we wanted to look at the resilience and the vulnerability of the family. And we also wanted to look at the experiences of the men after they came back. So that's just something about, I think, the need to broaden the types of research we do when we look at reintegration. And I know I'm running out of time, but perhaps I want to also talk about this young Bangladeshi man very quickly, Aziz, and just tell you about him. The photo of him, and that's his father, he sent back money from Singapore where he was a painter. And that enabled them to start a small business in his home village. And there were not many customers, but Aziz came home to Bangladesh with no money at the end of his migration. And his father, because his father was so disgusted with him, the father took away his shop that Aziz had paid for, and the father took it over and beat Aziz, violently beat him for coming home with no money. So that was very sad, and Aziz was married, but the family, the father-in-law, would not let Aziz live with his wife upon return. So you can't really see it there, but Aziz was stuck in this shack, this rented shack out of the back of his parents-in-law's house. And his family, his natal family, also wouldn't let him stay with them. So this is some of the contexts of return that are facing many of the men that I deal with in my research. But there's something interesting about this story that I think is also important to tell you. Aziz was not trafficked. He sustained serious injury in his job. He fell from a ladder while painting the US Embassy in Singapore and broke his back. Now, the reason I want to include his story in this presentation is because there are many men in this case who experience degrees of exploitation in their labour migration experience and precarious work, but are not victims of trafficking. But I can't often see the difference in their experiences of return and integration into their home communities from people who have been trafficked. And for people like Aziz who are not trafficked, there is no difference, and in many cases his experience was just as severe and possibly even worse. So I think we don't want to be creating false dichotomies between migrants who are exploited and migrants who are trafficked and migrants who fail. And I think these categories need to be looked at much more, with much more scrutiny and much more care. Perhaps I won't focus on this one because it's a long story as well. You can read about that one in my paper. And the last project, just quickly, that I want to tell you about is, we talked about education briefly last week. So I have this project where I'm taking 18 senior undergraduate university students to Cambodia in May. And we got a small grant, amazingly, from Singapore's Trafficking in Persons Task Force, who normally I don't like saying nice things about Singapore, but they did give me this grant. And so the students are going to be working in conjunction with 5 NGOs, and they're going to be doing research projects identified by the NGOs, and then they're going to write reports about based on their research. So these are the 5 projects. I won't read them all out and go into them. But the point I want to make is that what I think is really important, and I'm trying to think about ways in which research and awareness raising and capacity building can kind of be built hand in hand. And I think that that's really important, because we need to be doing research that is identified and relevant to the NGOs. And we also need to be raising the awareness of the younger generation. And so my students will all come back to Singapore, and eventually they will be teachers. So they will be able to go out into the education system and influence other young people based on their own experiences of doing this kind of research. Just finally, reflections. I think that some of the things I've been thinking about the last few days is this issue of connecting scales of small, perhaps on-the-ground projects and these sort of broad statistics and broad issues at the top. How can we better connect these two levels? And the other thing I think is that I consider myself an activist academic, and so one of the things is that I've researched a lot through practice and through support work with victims. And I tell you now that one of the things that's really important about that is that researchers see how the state works. You see how they disqualify victims. You see on what basis certain victims make it. And I think that that's a really important thing for researchers to be doing. Okay, I think I'll leave the other 2 points and perhaps you can ask me about them. So I'll end there. Thank you.